Carmine, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to hearing all about One Mind. And perhaps actually, if you could just start with a little bit of an introduction to One Mind, to the accelerator, but just a little bit about the whole ecosystem that is One Mind.
Yeah, happy to. So One Mind has been an organization in the mental health space for 31 years now. We had our 30-year anniversary last year. It started with the Staglin family and their son, Brandon Staglin, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was in school in college just over 30 years ago. And so they built this whole foundation sort of around supporting him and his serious mental illness. And Brandon was the president of One Mind for a long time. He's our chief advocacy and engagement officer now. And so he's been a huge part of the whole story. And so One Mind really started with this mission to, affect serious mental illness. So schizophrenia, bipolar, major depressive disorder, and started off as a fundraising mechanism, starting with the music festival, which they still do every year in Napa at the Stadlin's home, and then expanded into providing grants to up-and-coming scientists through our Rising Star Awards program. Then we, started co-sponsoring different research projects in different areas and then building out our own programs, like One Mind at Work, which provides mental health resources in the Mental Health Index to a consortium of, very large companies like Bank of America, McKinsey, Accenture, and folks like that to help them improve the mental health of the workforce. And then about 3 years ago, we launched the One Mind Accelerator. I was at Techstars and came over to help build and launch that initiative. It started just as, conversations and notes in a Google Doc. And now 3 years later, we've done 3 cohorts, 37 companies. The companies are valued at almost $4 billion across the portfolio. They've raised over 600 million post demo day across the 3 cohorts, and have served almost 1 million patients, across that population. So we've seen really good results with the companies. We really focus on companies tackling the hardest problems in mental health. And so that can look like a lot of different things. We do, a good mix of like services, digital health innovation type companies, companies that are, targeting underrepresented populations, youth mental health, maternal mental health, things of that nature. And then folks who are targeting, serious mental illness. So, treatments and platforms for things like bipolar and schizophrenia, on one side. And then on the other side, we do really like deep science companies that are going through FDA, doing clinical trials, building medical devices, neurotech and neuromodulation, and then drug development and biotech companies as well. So for example, in this last cohort, we had 3 companies that were developing, variations of psychedelic compounds, some without the trip aspect of it, some that enhance that portion of it based on, what the science says about how that impacts the brain. Folks developing, novel treatments for different forms of serious mental illness. And so, by having this really good mix of companies, we've been able to create this community that I think is unlike, any other in the world, where you just have this great exchange of information between the companies. And now we're gearing up for the 4th cohort. We'll do 14 to 16 companies. We'll at that point be over 50 companies in the alumni community. And really start shifting our focus towards, how do we make it the strongest alumni community out there in the mental health space?
That's incredible to be getting, as you say, that portfolio effect as well across the different cohorts. And you perhaps started to answer my next question, which is really around the areas, the themes within mental health that you think right now are some of the best investment prospects. I wonder if you can just take a step back and looking across the portfolios and the different cohorts that you've had, are there particular areas that you think are particularly strong from an investment point of view? And perhaps with those, give a sense of what your timelines are, what your prospects are in terms of an ROI. I think when people start to think about investing in mental health, some of these basic questions are very useful and interesting to hear experienced funds speak about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've had some really, kind of outsized wins in the portfolio so far. So good example of that would be Function Health, which raised their Series B this past year, became a unicorn company, and they do a massive array of blood tests, really comprehensive body health, and we help them to, start integrating behavioral health biomarkers into that as well. So I think the space of direct to consumer functional health is exploding right now. There are a lot of companies trying to get in on that space, whether it's through the way that they're doing it. There's several people trying to do that now as well. Or, we have a company in this last cohort, Metabolic Psychiatry Labs, which is, basically they're using a ketogenic therapy, a ketogenic diet as therapy for, forms of mental illness. And it started with bipolar, but it could be used for a bunch of other things as well. And so I think you're starting to see this like functional approach to health, which has been popular in other aspects of healthcare, now becoming a part of mental health as well. We think that's going to be a really big area going forward. The other one that's obvious is AI and mental health, but I think what is less obvious is, how that's going to be applied and in what way that's going to be useful to people. We had two companies in the last cohort. One was Slingshot AI, which just launched their product the other day. They've raised almost $100 million. They're absolutely crushing it, and they're building a foundational model for psychiatry. So basically, the premise is, what if you had all of the world's expertise about mental health put into an application, $10 a month? Now everybody has access to this incredible resource that, just didn't exist before. And, then the question is, does that just become somebody's therapist? Maybe not, but it gives you, it scales the accessibility to this incredible base of knowledge in a really safe and clinically proven way, at a time when there's a lot of options out there, which are not, and will just tell you what you want to hear and come up with all sorts of stuff that won't be helpful. They've built, a really clinically strong model for doing this at scale at, a tiny fraction of the cost of other mental health interventions. So, I think it's a huge leap forward. And then with Gemini, which is the other AI mental health company we had this year, they actually do AI in partnership with the therapist. So you see your therapist, but your therapist is using Gemini and you're working with Gemini in between the therapy sessions. So now you're getting this great feedback loop. You're actually practicing with things for therapy. You're seeing how you're progressing, and the therapist is getting all this information on you in between sessions, which just didn't exist before. And so we think that has the potential to just totally transform the patient therapist relationship and the effectiveness, of that kind of intervention. So I think those two areas are big. And then more on the science side, especially in psychedelics, there are all these compounds out there, natural compounds that have been around for millennia and that people have been getting value from. But the way that those compounds are not necessarily scalable, and they're not for everybody. Not everybody is going to want to go and do a 10-hour journey in the forest somewhere. Some people might love the idea of that, but not everyone will. And so, how can you isolate the therapeutic benefits of that and turn this into something that can be scaled, at a reasonable cost and given to, millions of people that might need it? So I think that's a really interesting area as well. I think you're seeing big pharma start to take a real interest in psychiatric conditions. For decades, they kind of pushed that to the side. But now you're starting to see real development in that space again. So those are some of the areas that we're super interested in. And then just the last piece would be neuromodulation, stuff with, ultrasound therapy and, even updated forms of TMS, where you don't have to go to the office every day for 6 weeks at a time to see a breakthrough. There's just some really interesting stuff that's happening in terms of how you're actually impacting the structure of the brain. And we're excited to see where that goes.
You've covered so many interesting examples. One thing I'm particularly interested in is because the science and the technology is moving so quickly, it's getting a sense of what is commercially viable and highly investable right now versus what is coming online in the next maybe 3 to 5 years. Is there an area that you've either already mentioned or something you haven't mentioned that you think is still early days, but you think is a really exciting prospect, but the science tech isn't quite there yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you're talking about developing drug compounds and new molecules, it's just you will not be selling that to anybody in, a 3 to 5 year timeline, generally speaking. And so we're really big on, patient capital. You have to be willing to invest in those things now and then see them grow to where they possibly could go. But we know we're not going to see a huge return on those things in the next, couple of years, but potentially a huge return and potentially a huge impact, beyond that. And then I would also say, I think a misconception is you invest in a drug company They have to go through their full slate of clinical trials. They have to distribute it out to people. And then maybe you make money 10, 15 years from now. But what really happens is that they get through maybe their phase 2 clinical trials, and then they get acquired by a huge pharma company. And so you as the early investor are actually going to get a great return potentially much earlier than that, because the big pharma companies are going to buy these companies way before they're actually distributing out to market. So it happens a lot earlier in the process than people, I think, maybe think when they're thinking about, drug development and discovery. Um, and then, some of the other areas, like I think AI and mental health is happening now. And it's just a matter of, it's hard to pick the ones that are going to be successful because it's such a crowded market. Out of the applications that we get, hundreds of applications, an enormous percent of them are, AI and mental health in some way. And it's really trying to figure out, what is a clinically validated tool? What is actually going to work in the workflow of how people work? And who has the team to actually, build and expand this? Because in that space, I think you just have to be moving really quickly in order to, stand out from that huge wave of competition.
For someone who is looking to get started investing into mental health, what would your advice be?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the starting place is always just having lots of conversations with people. You should be talking to folks like us that have, an ecosystem view of what's happening, talking to the other VCs that, have a lot of experience being in the space, talking to founders. And I think, it's helpful to go straight to the source and talk to the folks who are doing research. I'm lucky in my job that I talk to a lot of, people who are leading cutting edge research in a lot of different areas of mental health. And sometimes the only way to really know, what's going to be coming up in the future is to actually be talking to the folks who are building that right now. And that might not be happening at the company level because it might still be in a laboratory somewhere. And so we spend a lot of time actually talking to the scientists who are doing the research today and figuring out, okay, is this going to be, a commercial application? Is there going to be some other model for getting this to patients? How long is that going to take? What's that going to look like? But I think it's just, you have to be on the ground. I don't think it's a space where you can kind of just pull a Crunchbase list and then, figure it out from there. I think you really need to be talking to people on the ground, both founders, investors, and then also the scientists and researchers.
And being cheeky, one last question, just because you do see such you have such an ecosystem view of this. What is changing from a business and commercial financial viability point of view in terms of the business models that these founders are developing? Are you seeing shifts within public policy, within insurance models? You mentioned earlier about doing much more sort of direct to consumer, which seems potentially like a very big untapped revenue stream potential. But what are you seeing from those kind of changing commercial angles to mental health innovation?
Well, in the US right now, everything is changing at a rapid pace. And so, so much of mental health happens in Medicaid, and we don't know what the future of Medicaid is. And, a lot of companies that we've worked with depend on Medicaid, depend on those rates, to have a sustainable business. And now we're having to figure out, what alternatives to that look like. And I think a lot of that is still really unclear right now, but what we do is that we're really close with a lot of the government agencies. We're really close with a lot of the policy kind of advocacy nonprofits here in the US. And so I was just on a call the other day where, there are programs being developed through the government to basically find, ways to still engage with Medicaid or to still have the government be the payer for some of these behavioral health services. But it's not like how it was in the recent future or recent past where you could just, apply for Medicaid and now start getting reimbursed for Medicaid. That was never an easy process on its own, but now like you have to find these kind of niche programs within the government and apply to those and show, very specific results in order to get that funding. So I think the Medicaid government side is a huge piece of it. I think, generally payers are, paying less for behavioral health services, than they have in recent years, and it's becoming an increasing cost for them. And so because of that, there's like pressure on the price to bring that down. So then direct to consumer starts to look a lot more, appealing, but it's really expensive to do direct to consumer as well because your customer acquisition costs are generally going to be high. So what we're coaching the founders on is like, how can you get direct to the customer in as affordable way as possible? whether that's doing, referral deals with large provider groups, really kind of building like a community-based business where you have a lot of word of mouth and you can expand out that way. But I think it's very hard to make a business work just by buying up a ton of paid ads, and the rates on that just continue to go up and up. And so now your LTV on a customer just has to be enormous to make that work. And so we're trying to get creative with that with the founders. Luckily, founders are some of the most creative people we'll meet, and they're figuring it out. But it's a time of huge change. And I think the ultimate problem with behavioral health is just always who's going to pay for it. Who's going to pay for it at a rate that's, commensurate with, the impact of the service. And right now that just doesn't happen often.
Carmine, thank you. That was so incredibly practical as well as helpful. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.